What would you have done if ordered to execute innocent civilians? This question has haunted humanity since the end of World War II, echoing through courtrooms, classrooms, and countless conversations about moral responsibility in the face of evil. For decades after the war concluded, a comfortable myth persisted throughout the Western world that German soldiers had no choice but to follow orders, no matter how monstrous those orders might be. The world believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that refusing meant certain death, that saying no to atrocity was simply impossible under the iron grip of Nazi military law. Soldiers who participated in the Holocaust and other war crimes were portrayed, even by themselves, as tragic figures caught in an impossible situation where disobedience meant execution by firing squad. This narrative served multiple purposes, providing psychological comfort to former soldiers, enabling Germany's reintegration into Western defense structures during the Cold War, and offering a simple explanation for how ordinary men became participants in extraordinary evil. But when historians finally gained comprehensive access to the Wehrmacht's own meticulously kept records in archives scattered across Germany and captured by Allied forces, they discovered something that would fundamentally challenge everything previously understood about individual responsibility during the Third Reich. The German military, with characteristic bureaucratic thoroughness, had documented its military justice system in exhaustive detail. Every court-martial proceeding, every sentence handed down, every execution carried out, every transfer ordered as punishment had been carefully recorded in files that filled room after room in various archives. The Americans had seized tons of German military records at the war's end and shipped them back to the United States. The Soviets had captured equally massive quantities of documentation from the Eastern Front. German archives themselves contained records that had somehow survived the final chaotic months of the war. The revelation came not as a dramatic announcement or a single shocking document, but as a slow, disturbing realization that emerged from thousands upon thousands of dusty court-martial files, execution records, military correspondence, and administrative paperwork. Historians who spent years examining these documents began comparing notes, sharing findings, and gradually recognizing patterns that completely contradicted the accepted narrative. What shocked these researchers was not what they expected to find in the records, but rather what was conspicuously missing from these documents. The discovery would ultimately dismantle one of the most persistent and consequential myths about Nazi Germany and force an entire generation to confront profoundly uncomfortable questions about choice, complicity, and the nature of evil itself. The archives revealed a paradox that seemed almost impossible to comprehend, a contradiction so stark that many initially refused to believe it. While the Nazi military machine executed between 18,000 and 22,000 of its own soldiers during World War II for desertion and undermining military morale, creating one of history's most brutal military justice systems, historians found virtually no documented cases of soldiers being executed for refusing to participate in war crimes or the murder of civilians. The records told two entirely different stories, depending on what soldiers refused to do, and the implications were absolutely devastating for how the war and its atrocities would be understood. A soldier who went absent without leave for a few days, who stole military supplies, who expressed doubts about German victory, who attempted to desert his unit, who injured himself to escape combat, these soldiers faced swift and merciless punishment that often ended at the execution post. The records documented their cases in numbing detail, thousands upon thousands of young men, many barely out of their teenage years, who were tried, sentenced, and shot for violations of military discipline. But soldiers who refused to participate in mass executions of Jews, who declined to shoot civilian hostages, who expressed unwillingness to kill prisoners of war. These soldiers appeared in the records too, but their stories took dramatically different turns. They faced consequences, certainly, but execution was virtually never among them. This discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community. If soldiers were not generally executed for refusing to commit war crimes, then what did that mean for the millions who had participated in the Holocaust and other atrocities? The comfortable narrative that soldiers had no choice, that they were simply following orders under threat of death, crumbled in the face of archival evidence. A more disturbing reality emerged. Participation in the greatest crimes of the 20th century was, in the vast majority of cases, a choice that soldiers made for reasons having nothing to do with fear of execution. The implications extended far beyond academic historical debates. Criminal trials of Nazi war criminals had relied heavily on the assumption that refusing orders meant death. The famous Nuremberg defense, "I was just following orders," rested on the premise that soldiers had no alternative. But if that premise was false, if the archival records demonstrated that soldiers who refused to commit war crimes were generally transferred rather than executed, then every war crimes trial, every legal proceeding, every historical judgment about culpability required re-examination. The foundation upon which post-war understanding of Nazi crimes had been built was fundamentally unsound. The story of Nazi military justice begins not in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, but in the bitter ashes of Germany's defeat in World War I and the traumatic years that followed. German commanders and military jurists had drawn a conclusion from that defeat that would poison military culture for an entire generation. They believed the Imperial German Army had been too lenient with deserters and malcontents, and that this leniency had cost Germany the war. In their minds, deserters and malingerers had stabbed the victorious German army in the back, just as it stood on the verge of triumph. This myth, though historically false and repeatedly disproven by serious scholarship, became gospel truth among German military leadership, veteran organizations, and nationalist political movements. They made a solemn vow that if Germany ever went to war again, there would be no repetition of such weakness. Mercy would not be shown to those who failed in their military duty. The contrast with the First World War was staggering and provided the foundation for everything that would follow. Imperial Germany had executed fewer than 100 deserters during that entire 4-year conflict, a number dramatically lower than the executions carried out by Italy, France, Great Britain, or Russia during the same period. France had executed hundreds of its own soldiers, often after show trials that lasted mere minutes. The British had shot dozens for cowardice and desertion, including cases that became infamous for their injustice. Russia's military had been even more brutal, executing thousands in attempts to maintain discipline as the Tsarist regime collapsed. By comparison, the German Imperial Army had been remarkably restrained in its use of capital punishment against its own soldiers. But the officers and judges who survived the war and remained in military service or legal positions during the Weimar Republic convinced themselves that this comparative leniency had been a catastrophic mistake. They refused to accept that Germany had been defeated on the battlefield by superior Allied resources, the exhaustion of German manpower and industrial capacity, and the entry of the United States into the war. Instead, they embraced the stab-in-the-back legend, the Dolchstoßlegende, blaming Jews, Bolsheviks, Social Democrats, deserters, and civilian politicians for Germany's collapse. In this narrative, the army had remained undefeated in the field, still holding defensive positions as the armistice was signed. The catastrophe had come from within, from those who had undermined morale, spread defeatism, and eventually launched the November Revolution that toppled the Kaiser and established the Weimar Republic. This legend was pure fiction, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed the German military establishment to avoid confronting the reality of its strategic failures and the impossibility of victory once the United States entered the war. But fiction or not, the legend shaped policy and mindset for the next generation of German military leadership. References to the events of 1918 appeared constantly in court-martial records from World War II, in psychological evaluations of soldiers, in orders from high command. Hitler himself repeatedly invoked the specter of 1918, warning that any sign of defeatism or collapse of discipline would lead to Germany's destruction. The entire Nazi military justice system was constructed on the foundation of preventing another 1918, of ensuring through terror and ruthless punishment that soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender or desert. When the Nazi Party rose to power in January 1933, they found eager collaborators in the Wehrmacht's legal establishment. But here was one of the crucial revelations that shocked historians when they examined the records. The brutalization of German military justice did not require Nazi ideology to radicalize it from without. The military jurists had already formed their own conclusions independently during the Weimar period. They had already decided, based on their interpretation of World War I's lessons, that harsh, merciless punishment was absolutely necessary for military effectiveness. Nazi terminology and racial rhetoric simply provided new vocabulary and additional justification for attitudes that the military establishment had cultivated entirely on its own. The evidence for this could be found in the careers and writings of the men who would staff the Wehrmacht's military justice system. Many had served as military judges or legal officers during World War I and the Weimar period. They had written articles and treatises arguing for more stringent military discipline. They had criticized the Weimar Republic's Article 106, which had abolished separate military courts and subjected military justice to civilian legal oversight. When Hitler restored military courts in 1933 through special legislation, these legal officers celebrated the return to what they considered proper military justice, independent of civilian interference and capable of imposing the harsh punishments they believed necessary. The records demonstrate that by September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and plunged Europe into World War II, a comprehensive military legal system was already in place, ready to operate with maximum efficiency and brutality. The Wehrmacht had established courts-martial in every division, created a sophisticated network of military judges and prosecutors, and implemented a military penal code that made desertion and various forms of insubordination punishable by death. Supporting this judicial structure was an extensive military police apparatus, including the Feldgendarmerie, Field Gendarmerie, the Geheime Feldpolizei, Secret Field Police, and various other investigative organizations whose methods, according to contemporary accounts, were brutal and ruthless. What made this system particularly effective and deadly was not simply its structure or its laws, which on paper did not differ dramatically from military justice codes in other nations, but rather the mindset of those who operated it and the ideology that justified its severity. The judges, prosecutors, and military police who staffed this system genuinely believed they were preventing a repetition of 1918. They saw themselves as guardians of military effectiveness and German national survival. In their minds, harsh punishment of deserters and defeatists was not cruelty, but necessity, not injustice, but patriotic duty. One key document changed the game entirely and demonstrated the premeditation behind what would become history's most brutal military justice system. On August 17, 1938, more than a year before the war began, Germany enacted the Kriegssonderstrafrechtsverordnung, a special wartime criminal law that vastly expanded the grounds for capital punishment in the military. This law, passed while Germany was nominally at peace, reflected the determination of military leadership to prevent any repetition of what they perceived as the collapse of discipline in 1918. It was a declaration of intent. This time there would be no mercy for those who failed to do their duty, no tolerance for weakness, no second chances for those who wavered in their commitment to German victory. The law's provisions were sweeping and ominous. It dramatically expanded the definition of desertion to include a wide range of behaviors. It created new categories of offenses related to undermining military morale, a catch-all charge that could be applied to anyone who expressed doubt about German victory, criticized military leadership, or spread defeatist attitudes. It strengthened provisions for summary punishment, allowing officers to impose severe penalties, including death in certain circumstances, without formal court-martial proceedings. It established special wartime procedures that reduced the rights of the accused and accelerated the pace of military justice to ensure swift punishment. Most significantly, the law reflected the deep integration of Nazi ideology into military justice. Soldiers were not to be judged simply on their actions, but on their character as assessed through National Socialist criteria. The law's language and subsequent implementation guidelines made clear that judges should consider whether defendants demonstrated proper racial and ideological reliability. A soldier from a good German family with impeccable Nazi credentials might receive leniency for an offense that would send a soldier with Jewish ancestry or suspected communist sympathies to the execution post. The architecture of Nazi military justice was built on three interlocking pillars: regular courts-martial that handled routine military discipline according to established procedures, special wartime provisions that expanded the definition of punishable offenses and accelerated proceedings, and an ideologically driven interpretation of what constituted proper military behavior rooted in Nazi racial and political ideology. Understanding how this system evolved from traditional military law into an apparatus of terror that would ultimately execute more than 20,000 of its own soldiers requires examining the journey from the relatively restrained practices of the Imperial German Army to the ruthless machine that functioned during World War II. From 1934 onward, every division of the Reichswehr, and later the Wehrmacht, had a court-martial. This was not unusual in itself. Most military forces around the world maintained similar structures for addressing breaches of military discipline. Courts-martial were seen as necessary institutions for maintaining order, enforcing regulations, and ensuring that soldiers met their obligations. What differentiated the Nazi system from its contemporaries was not the existence of military courts, but rather the systematic integration of ideological considerations into legal proceedings and the dramatically escalating severity of punishments as the war progressed and German fortunes declined. The military legal code drew increasingly sharp distinctions between different types of offenses, creating a hierarchy of crimes that reflected both traditional military concerns and Nazi ideological priorities. Desertion, that most fundamental of military offenses, was categorized into multiple degrees of severity based on circumstances and perceived motivation. A soldier who went absent without leave for a few days to visit family or escape the hardships of military life might receive imprisonment, particularly early in the war when manpower was not yet desperately short. A soldier who deserted his post in the face of the enemy, abandoning his comrades during combat, faced execution with near certainty. A soldier who deserted and crossed enemy lines was guaranteed a death sentence if captured, as such action was viewed not merely as abandonment of duty, but as potential treason. But perhaps the most revealing category in the military legal code was undermining military morale, or Wehrkraftzersetzung, a catch-all charge that could be applied to anyone who expressed doubt about German victory, criticized military or political leadership, spread news of defeats or setbacks, or engaged in behavior deemed to weaken fighting spirit. This offense had no clear definition and could be interpreted with enormous latitude by judges and prosecutors. A soldier who told comrades that Germany was losing the war could be charged. A soldier who questioned Hitler's strategic decisions could face trial. A soldier who expressed war weariness or desire for peace became vulnerable to prosecution. The vagueness of the charge made it a powerful tool of control, as soldiers could never be entirely certain what statements or behaviors might lead to court-martial. The statistics compiled from surviving military justice records tell a grim story of escalating brutality that tracked closely with the progress of the war, and particularly with Germany's declining military fortunes. From September 1939 to September 1940, the first year of the war, the Wehrmacht executed 515 soldiers. This number, while tragic for those individuals and their families, seemed relatively modest given the massive expansion of German military forces to millions of men. The rate of execution per 100,000 soldiers was actually lower than what Imperial Germany had imposed during World War I. Some historians initially interpreted this as evidence that the Wehrmacht had not yet fully embraced the harsh disciplinary philosophy that leaders had advocated. But the trajectory was unmistakable and ominous. From September 1940 to September 1941, executions dropped slightly to 445, perhaps reflecting Germany's string of military victories in France, the Balkans, and North Africa, which created optimism and reduced desertion rates. Then came June 1941 and Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union that would eventually prove Germany's doom. Everything changed. The Eastern Front, with its vast distances, brutal combat, extreme weather, and increasingly fierce Soviet resistance, created circumstances that tested German soldiers beyond their limits. Desertion rates increased. Combat stress overwhelmed soldiers. The ruthless partisan warfare behind German lines created security problems that the Wehrmacht addressed with mass reprisals and terror. From September 1941 to September 1942, executions more than tripled to 1,648. The following year, from September 1942 to September 1943, saw another dramatic increase to 2,148 executions. This period bracketed the Battle of Stalingrad, where an entire German army was destroyed in horrific conditions. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked the turning point of the war. As news of the disaster spread through German forces, military leadership became obsessed with preventing any collapse of morale or discipline. The spectre of 1918 haunted every decision. Courts-martial moved faster, sentences became harsher, and the execution rate accelerated. From September 1943 to September 1944, executions reached 4,039, nearly doubling again. By this point, Germany was clearly losing the war on all fronts. Soviet offensives were driving German forces back in the east. Allied forces had invaded Italy and were preparing for the Normandy landings. German cities were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Resource shortages crippled military operations, yet Hitler and the Nazi leadership demanded continued resistance, and the military justice system became a primary tool for enforcing that demand. Soldiers who expressed defeatism, who suggested that further resistance was futile, who proposed surrender or even tactical retreat, faced court-martial and often execution. But these figures, meticulously documented in official military court records and preserved in various archives, represented only part of the story. The numbers covered only sentences handed down by regular military tribunals following formal court-martial procedures, however abbreviated those procedures might have been. They excluded the final chaotic months of 1945, when record-keeping broke down completely as the Reich collapsed. Most significantly, these statistics did not account for summary executions carried out without formal court proceedings, or the victims of the flying courts-martial that terrorized German troops in the war's final stages. The flying courts-martial, formerly known as Fliegendes Sonderstandgericht, represented the ultimate corruption of military justice and the final descent into pure terror as a tool of control. Authorized by Hitler through a decree in March 1945, as the Third Reich faced imminent collapse, these mobile tribunals raced from one military unit to another, conducting show trials and ordering executions with breathtaking speed. The proceedings bore absolutely no resemblance to legitimate legal process, however harsh. Officers with no legal training whatsoever served simultaneously as judge, jury, and prosecutor. Trials lasted minutes rather than hours, with defendants given no opportunity to prepare a defense, no access to legal counsel, no chance to present evidence or call witnesses. The verdict was invariably death, and execution followed within hours rather than days. One notorious case captured the essential character of these proceedings and demonstrated how completely the system had abandoned any pretense of justice. After American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945, providing a crucial crossing point over the Rhine River and opening a direct route into Germany's industrial heartland, Hitler flew into a rage and demanded scapegoats. Someone had to pay for this catastrophic failure that shortened the war and doomed Germany's last hopes. General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, who possessed no legal experience whatsoever, was dispatched to conduct trials of the officers allegedly responsible for the bridge's capture. Hübner's proceedings were farcical travesties that mocked every principle of military justice. He harangued defendants about their alleged command failures in brief show trials conducted in makeshift courtrooms, often in damaged buildings or even outdoors. The accused officers were given no opportunity to explain the impossible situation they had faced, the overwhelming Allied superiority in forces, the communication breakdowns that had plagued German commands in the war's final weeks. Hübner shouted accusations and pronounced sentences with the zeal of a fanatic enforcing ideological purity rather than military discipline. 5 officers were convicted: Major Hans Scheller, Captain Willy Bratke, Captain Karl Friesenhahn, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, Major Herbert Strobel, and Major August Kraft. Only one defendant, Captain Friesenhahn, escaped the death penalty. He had unsuccessfully attempted to detonate explosive charges wired to the bridge structure before Allied forces secured it, demonstrating that he had at least tried to fulfill his duty, even if circumstances prevented success. The other 4 convicted officers faced execution. Within 24 hours of their conviction, all except Captain Bratke, who had been captured by American forces along with Friesenhahn, were taken to nearby woods, executed with a shot to the back of the neck, in the style of secret police rather than military executions, and buried where they fell without ceremony or proper military honors. These flying courts-martial swept through collapsing German positions in the final months of the war, leaving trails of bodies hanging from lampposts or propped against walls with signs proclaiming them cowards and traitors. Soldiers found a way from their units. Anyone suspected of attempting to desert or surrender, officers whose units had retreated without explicit orders, Even civilians who suggested that continued resistance was futile, all became potential victims of these roving executioners. Historians estimate that between 5,000 and 8,000 soldiers and civilians were summarily executed by flying courts-martial in just the last 4 months of the war alone, though the actual number may never be known with certainty given the chaos and incomplete records from that period. The German military court system, in its regular form throughout the war, processed approximately 1.5 million soldiers for various offenses ranging from minor disciplinary infractions to serious crimes. This massive caseload required an extensive bureaucracy of judges, prosecutors, defense counsel, clerks, and guards. Court-martial proceedings were supposed to follow established procedures, though these were increasingly abbreviated as the war progressed and the volume of cases overwhelmed the system. Of the 1.5 million soldiers processed through military courts, roughly 30,000 received death sentences. Perhaps 23,000 of these sentences were actually carried out, with the remainder either commuted to imprisonment or punishment battalions, or left unexecuted due to the war's end. But when historians added the estimated victims of flying courts-martial in the final months, plus the unknown number of summary executions carried out by officers in the field throughout the war, under provisions that authorized immediate punishment for certain offenses, the total number of Wehrmacht personnel killed by their own military justice system likely exceeded 50,000. This figure staggers the imagination. The Wehrmacht executed more of its own soldiers than Britain, France, and the United States combined, executed over both world wars. The Soviet military during World War II executed comparable or perhaps even higher numbers, though precise statistics remain elusive, given incomplete records and the chaos of Soviet military administration. What made these executions particularly haunting was the youth of many victims. Court-martial records that survived reveal that significant numbers of executed soldiers were between 18 and 20 years old, conscripts who had been drafted into a war they neither started nor understood. Many had been children when Hitler came to power, teenagers when the war began. They knew no other system than the Nazi regime. Yet when they failed to meet the impossible demands placed upon them by that regime, when combat stress broke them, or when they simply tried to survive rather than die for a lost cause, the system destroyed them with the same ruthless efficiency it had brought to everything else. The method of execution varied but followed general patterns. Soldiers condemned for desertion were typically shot by firing squad, often composed of their own comrades in a deliberate attempt to implicate the entire unit in enforcement of discipline. Soldiers convicted of more serious offenses, particularly those involving perceived cowardice in the face of the enemy or undermining morale, might be hanged, with bodies left displayed as warnings to others. In the final months of the war, as the system descended into complete chaos, executions became even more brutal and arbitrary. Soldiers were hung from lampposts in town squares, shot in the streets where they were apprehended, executed in batches without proper documentation. The psychological impact of this reign of terror on German soldiers cannot be overstated. Every soldier lived with the knowledge that even minor infractions could lead to court-martial, and that court-martial often meant execution. This fear was deliberately cultivated by military leadership as a tool of control. Orders issued to units fighting on the Eastern Front explicitly instructed officers to use extreme measures, including personal weapons, against soldiers who showed signs of panic or defeatism. The message was clear. Soldiers should fear their own officers more than they feared the enemy, because death at enemy hands was merely possible, while death for failing in military duty was certain. The Nazi military justice system embodied several deeply interconnected themes that historians found profoundly disturbing when they examined the archival records with careful attention to patterns and implications. The first major theme was the perversion of the concept of military obedience itself. Modern German military doctrine emphasizes innere Führung, a difficult-to-translate concept that centers military service around the inner conscience of each individual soldier. This philosophy holds that soldiers are expected to engage in what is called thinking obedience, to evaluate orders critically, to consider their moral and legal implications, and to refuse those that are manifestly illegal or immoral. The Nazi military demanded precisely the opposite, unthinking obedience coupled with ideological fervor. Soldiers were expected to execute orders without question or hesitation, particularly orders that aligned with Nazi ideological goals. The very idea of questioning an order, of weighing its morality or legality, was treated as a kind of treason against the state and the cause. The second major theme that emerged from the records was the systematic, deliberate use of terror as a primary tool of military cohesion and control. The Wehrmacht leadership understood, particularly after Stalingrad and the turning of the tide in 1943, that Germany was fighting a war it ultimately could not win. Resources were inadequate, manpower was being exhausted, the industrial capacity of the Allies vastly exceeded Germany's capabilities, and the strategic situation was deteriorating on every front. As military defeat became increasingly inevitable and obvious even to common soldiers, the regime relied more and more heavily on fear rather than genuine motivation to keep soldiers fighting. The steady, relentless increase in executions for desertion and undermining morale reflected this growing desperation. Officers received explicit instructions to use extreme measures, including personal firearms, against soldiers who showed any signs of panic, defeatism, or unwillingness to continue fighting. Orders issued to units fighting on the Eastern Front captured this mentality with chilling clarity. One divisional order from July 1943, issued in response to incidents of what commanders termed tank panic among troops facing superior Soviet armor, explicitly instructed all officers and non-commissioned officers to use, without any scruple, the harshest measures, including the use of personal weapons, against soldiers who displayed fear or attempted to flee from Soviet tanks. This was not a vague suggestion or a metaphorical threat. It was a direct authorization for officers to shoot their own men. In April 1945, as the Soviet noose tightened around Berlin and German forces everywhere faced annihilation, one company commander submitted a report describing how his men, traumatized by days of heavy Soviet bombardment, had become completely apathetic and unresponsive. They preferred being shot by their own officers, he wrote, rather than remaining in position facing continued Soviet assault. This represented the ultimate perverse success of the terror system. Soldiers feared their own leadership more than enemy action, and that fear kept them in place even when rational self-preservation would have dictated flight or surrender. The third major theme that pervaded the entire system was the deep integration of Nazi racial and ideological thinking into every aspect of military law and its application. Soldiers were increasingly judged not simply on their actions or their violations of military regulations, but on their character, as defined by National Socialist criteria. Court-martial records examined by historians reveal that judges explicitly considered whether defendants demonstrated what they termed a social personality traits, whether they came from good German stock, whether their family background suggested racial purity and political reliability. A soldier with a Jewish ancestor somewhere in his family tree, or whose parents had opposed the Nazi Party before 1933, or who came from a region with strong Catholic or social democratic traditions, faced dramatically harsher sentences than a soldier from an impeccable Nazi lineage who committed the exact same offense. This ideological contamination of military justice meant that outcomes depended not only on what soldiers did, but on who they were in racial and political terms. But the fourth theme, which proved most shocking to historians when they finally uncovered it systematically through archival research, was the profound and revealing inconsistency in how the system operated depending on the nature of the offense. Despite the elaborate structure of military justice, despite the thousands upon thousands of executions, despite the pervasive atmosphere of terror that hung over every German military unit, the system operated with striking leniency when it came to the most serious imaginable crimes: the murder of civilians, participation in Holocaust atrocities, and other war crimes. The Wehrmacht would execute a soldier for deserting his post, for stealing military property, for expressing doubts about ultimate German victory, for attempting to go absent without leave to visit his family. But when soldiers refused to murder innocent civilians, when they declined to participate in mass executions of Jews, when they expressed unwillingness to shoot prisoners of war or hostages, the military justice system revealed an entirely different face. Historian David H. Kitterman conducted groundbreaking research that fundamentally changed understanding of this issue. He painstakingly identified and studied a group of 135 German soldiers who had refused direct orders to kill Jews, prisoners of war, or civilian hostages during the war. These men had said no to participation in mass murder, the greatest crimes of the Nazi regime. They faced consequences, certainly, The records documented that clearly. Superior officers threatened them, sometimes quite seriously. Some received beatings or other forms of physical punishment from angry commanders or comrades. They endured verbal abuse, accusations of cowardice, questions about their loyalty and racial reliability. Several were transferred to punishment battalions, sent to particularly dangerous sectors of the front, or reassigned to penal units. Their military careers, such as they were, suffered. But the crucial finding that sent shockwaves through the historical community was this absolutely incontrovertible fact. Not one single soldier in Kitterman's study group was executed for refusing to commit war crimes. Not one. The implications of this discovery were profound, disturbing, and impossible to ignore. They fundamentally undermined the narrative that had dominated post-war understanding of German military participation in atrocities. The Nazi military would execute a soldier for deserting his post, for stealing supplies, for expressing defeatist attitudes, for attempting to escape military service through self-inflicted injury. These were serious military offenses, certainly, but they paled in moral significance compared to mass murder. Yet when soldiers refused the greatest crimes imaginable, when they declined to shoot Jewish children or machine gun prisoners, the system consistently found alternatives to execution. This pattern appeared again and again across the archival evidence with remarkable consistency. Historian Manfred Messerschmitt, one of the leading scholars of Wehrmacht military justice, examined literally thousands of court-martial records from various archives and confirmed that no documented case could be found where refusing to participate in war crimes against civilians resulted in execution. Captain Otto Fryer provided a particularly telling example that historians cited repeatedly in their work. Assigned to Neuengamme concentration camp to oversee executions and command a subcamp at Kaltenkirchen, Fryer found the work incompatible with his conscience and beliefs. He struggled with the moral implications of his assignment and made his discomfort known to superiors. He was judged too soft for the role, unsuited temperamentally to the brutality expected of concentration camp overseers. His punishment for this failure to enthusiastically participate in the camp system? Transfer to a different assignment, ultimately at his own request. He faced no court-martial, no imprisonment, no execution. He was simply moved to work, deemed more suitable to his character. The concept of Befehlsnotstand became absolutely central to understanding this paradox and to unraveling the myths that had obscured the truth for decades. This German legal term refers to a specific situation. Someone receives orders that violate law or basic morality, but refusing to carry out those orders would allegedly lead to drastic consequences for the person refusing, specifically danger to life or body, most significantly, execution. After the war ended and trials of Nazi war criminals began, many German soldiers and officers claimed Befehlsnotstand as their primary defense. They argued strenuously that they had absolutely no choice but to participate in atrocities because refusing would have meant their own immediate execution. The judges, prosecutors, and victims who heard this defense generally accepted it at face value, largely because it seemed plausible and because the brutality of Nazi military discipline was well documented in other contexts. But when historians finally examined the records with forensic precision and systematic methodology, comparing thousands of cases and tracking outcomes, they discovered that Befehlsnotstand as applied to war crimes was essentially a fiction, a convenient post-war invention that allowed perpetrators to avoid confronting their actual choices in society, to avoid grappling with the uncomfortable reality of widespread complicity. The archival evidence demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that German soldiers did not, generally speaking, face execution for refusing to participate in the Holocaust or other war crimes against civilians. They faced social pressure, informal punishment, potential career consequences, possible transfer to less desirable assignments, but not execution. The discovery of what actually happened when soldiers refused to participate in atrocities created both a monumental historical reckoning and an acute moral crisis that continues to reverberate through military ethics, international law, and historical consciousness decades later. If soldiers had not faced execution for refusing to commit war crimes, if the Befehlsnotstand defense was essentially a fabrication, then what did that mean for the millions who had participated in the Holocaust and other atrocities? The comfortable narrative of helpless compliance, of tragic figures with no choice but to follow monstrous orders, dissolved completely in the face of archival evidence. Historians, legal scholars, ethicists, and societies were forced to confront a far more disturbing reality. Participation in Holocaust atrocities and war crimes was, in the vast majority of cases, a choice that individuals made for complex reasons, having little to do with fear of their own execution. This revelation led to profound and far-reaching changes in how military ethics are understood, taught, and institutionalized, particularly within Germany's modern armed forces, but extending to military establishments throughout the democratic world. The Bundeswehr, established in 1955 when West Germany regained sovereignty and was permitted to rearm as part of NATO, was deliberately and consciously structured from its inception to prevent any possible repetition of Wehrmacht crimes. German law explicitly forbids using the military for any purpose other than defending Germany itself, though the military does participate in carefully circumscribed humanitarian missions and NATO coalition operations approved by the Bundestag. More importantly and more fundamentally, the entire philosophy of military service was reconstructed from the ground up based on principles that directly contradicted Wehrmacht practice. The concept of innere Führung became absolutely foundational to the new German military culture, embedded in every aspect of training, education, command relationships, and military law. This principle, which has no perfect English equivalent but is sometimes translated as internal leadership or leadership development and civic education, holds that every soldier must maintain their essential humanity and moral conscience while in uniform. A soldier does not check their ethical judgment at the gate when entering the barracks. Orders must be evaluated critically, not blindly followed. Unconditional obedience to superiors is explicitly rejected as fundamentally incompatible with democratic military service and human dignity. A 2007 government policy statement made this crystal clear in language that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. German soldiers cannot and must not obey unconditionally, but must instead engage in thinking obedience, or denkendem Gehorsam. However, the policy also specified carefully that soldiers cannot simply disobey orders because their personal political views or strategic assessments conflict with those of their superiors. The distinction is crucial and carefully maintained. Soldiers can and must refuse illegal orders, particularly those involving war crimes or crimes against humanity, but they cannot refuse lawful orders merely because they disagree with military strategy, dislike their assignments, or question policy decisions made by legitimate civilian authority. This transformation of German military culture is physically embodied at the Bendler Block, a historically significant building in Berlin where participants in the failed July 20th, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler were executed after hasty courts-martial. Today, the building serves as a museum dedicated to German resistance against Nazism, honoring those who attempted to stop Hitler and the Nazi regime, even at the cost of their own lives. Every year, in a ceremony laden with symbolism and historical consciousness, new German soldiers are traditionally sworn to their duties at this specific site. The message communicated by this practice could not be clearer or more deliberately chosen. The German military honors those who resisted criminal orders and criminal leaders, not those who claimed they had no choice but to follow such orders. Moral courage and the willingness to say no to illegal commands are presented as central military virtues, perhaps the most important virtues for soldiers in a democratic society. The legal ramifications of these historical discoveries extended far beyond military culture into Germany's entire judicial system and required decades of painful debate. For more than 40 years after World War II, German courts and German society wrestled with a seemingly intractable question: how should Wehrmacht deserters be treated legally and morally? Many had been executed for attempting to escape participation in what they recognized or came to recognize as a criminal war. Were these executed soldiers criminals who violated their military duty and betrayed their comrades? Or were they victims of Nazi injustice who made morally courageous choices? Should their wartime convictions stand as legitimate applications of then valid military law, or should they be overturned as products of an illegitimate regime? The question engaged survivors and perpetrators, playwrights and judges, historians and politicians, ordinary citizens and military veterans, in debates that grew increasingly heated as different German political parties and social movements staked out conflicting positions. It took nearly 60 years for Germany to reach a social and political consensus sufficient to resolve this question legislatively. In 2002, the German Bundestag finally passed comprehensive legislation that suspended and nullified verdicts issued against Wehrmacht soldiers for desertion and for homosexual activity, both of which had been treated as serious military crimes during the Nazi period. In 2009, additional legislative measures addressed soldiers who had been labeled war traitors, Kriegsverräter, for attempting to assist the Allies, providing information to enemy forces, or actively working to undermine the Nazi regime and hasten German defeat. These legislative acts represented official acknowledgement, endorsed by democratic majorities in the German parliament, that the Nazi military justice system had been fundamentally illegitimate in both its procedures and its purposes. Soldiers executed for desertion, for defeatism, for homosexuality, or for assisting the Allies were retroactively recognized as victims of Nazi injustice rather than criminals who violated legitimate military law and betrayed their nation. The memorial for the victims of NS military justice, unveiled in Cologne in 2009 after years of planning and public debate, stands as powerful physical testament to this fundamental reappraisal of the Nazi military justice system and its victims. Words made of metal form a distinctive shelter-like structure that visitors can enter and contemplate. The memorial's design and location articulate a clear, unambiguous position on deserters and those executed by Nazi military courts. They were not cowards or traitors who failed in their duty, but rather individuals who made morally courageous choices in impossible circumstances, choices that the democratic German state now honors. Similar memorials appeared in cities across Germany throughout the early 21st century, marking a fundamental shift in how the nation remembers its military past and distinguishes between legitimate military tradition and criminal perversion of military institutions. But the most important solution proposed by historians and ethicists who studied these records was educational. Military personnel worldwide needed to understand that the "I was just following orders" defense, known formally as the Superior Orders Defense or Nuremberg Defense, was not only morally bankrupt but historically false for many Nazi-era crimes. The research showed that German soldiers generally did have choices, particularly when it came to participating in atrocities against civilians. International military law evolved to reflect these findings. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols established clear principles. Combatants have an individual responsibility to refuse manifestly illegal orders, particularly those involving war crimes or crimes against humanity. Military training programs incorporated case studies from the Wehrmacht records to illustrate that systems of military discipline, no matter how harsh, cannot eliminate individual moral agency. Soldiers can say no, and many did, even under the Nazi regime. The practical application of these lessons proved challenging. Military forces must maintain discipline and cohesion while simultaneously fostering independent moral judgment. The balance is delicate. Armies cannot function if every soldier makes individual decisions about which orders to follow. Yet armies that demand unthinking obedience inevitably commit atrocities. Modern military ethics training attempts to navigate this tension by drawing clear distinctions between lawful orders that soldiers may dislike but must obey, and manifestly illegal orders that soldiers must refuse regardless of consequences. The archival discoveries raised troubling questions about the nature of complicity and the psychology of perpetrators. If German soldiers were not, generally speaking, forced to participate in the Holocaust and war crimes under threat of execution, why did so many participate? Why did relatively few refuse? The record suggested answers more disturbing than simple coercion. Some soldiers participated out of ideological conviction. They genuinely believed in Nazi racial ideology and viewed the murder of Jews, Roma, Slavs, and other targeted groups as necessary for Germany's survival and racial purity. Court-martial records and letters captured by Allied forces revealed that significant numbers of Wehrmacht soldiers embraced the Nazi worldview. They did not need to be forced to commit atrocities. They viewed such actions as righteous and necessary. Others participated out of careerism and opportunism. The military justice records showed that officers who demonstrated ruthlessness and ideological reliability received promotions and prestigious assignments. Those who expressed moral qualms or hesitation found their careers stalling. The incentive structure rewarded participation in crimes and punished moral resistance, even when it did not rise to the level of court-martial or execution. Transfer to less desirable positions, denial of leave, assignment to dangerous sectors of the front, social ostracism within military units, these informal punishments were often sufficient to ensure compliance. The power of social pressure and group dynamics cannot be underestimated. Soldiers who refused to participate in executions or atrocities often faced intense peer pressure and accusations of cowardice from fellow soldiers. Military units developed their own internal cultures, and these cultures strongly influenced individual behavior. In units where atrocities were normalized and expected, refusing to participate meant setting oneself apart from the group, risking social isolation and loss of comrades' respect. This pressure, though not as dramatic as threat of execution, proved remarkably effective at securing compliance. The banality of evil, the concept Hannah Arendt famously explored, found support in the military records. Many perpetrators appeared remarkably ordinary in their motivations and justifications. They were not ideological fanatics or sadists, but bureaucrats in uniform who compartmentalized their actions and focused on following procedures rather than confronting the moral meaning of what they did. The court-martial records contain testimony from soldiers who described killing civilians with the same emotional detachment they might bring to routine administrative tasks. But perhaps the most troubling aspect revealed by the archives was the degree to which participation in atrocities became self-reinforcing. Psychological research conducted after the war suggested that once soldiers crossed the threshold of participating in mass murder, subsequent participation became easier. The cognitive dissonance created by committing atrocities while maintaining self-image as decent people required psychological resolution. Rather than confronting guilt, many perpetrators resolved this dissonance by doubling down on ideological justifications, by dehumanizing victims further, by becoming more deeply committed to the Nazi cause that made their crimes seem necessary and justified. The records also revealed the Wehrmacht's systematic preparation of soldiers for criminal warfare. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was preceded by explicit orders suspending normal rules of warfare. The Barbarossa Decree and related directives authorized German forces to kill Soviet commissars without trial, to take collective reprisals against civilians for partisan activity, and to show no mercy to suspected enemies. These orders created a legal framework, at least within Nazi military law, for mass violence against civilians. Soldiers, who might have hesitated to commit atrocities without authorization, received explicit instruction that such actions were not only permitted, but expected. The research raised profound questions about how societies can prevent such catastrophes. If the threat of punishment is not what drove most soldiers to participate in war crimes, then strengthening military discipline or making punishment more severe is not the answer. If ideological indoctrination, careerism, social pressure, and psychological mechanisms of self-justification were the primary drivers of participation in atrocities, then prevention requires different approaches. Some historians argued that the Wehrmacht records demonstrated the importance of maintaining clear moral and legal boundaries, even in wartime. Once organizations authorize or normalize atrocities, individual moral resistance becomes exponentially more difficult. The solution is preventing the erosion of ethical standards in the first place, maintaining robust democratic civilian control of military forces, and creating military cultures that reward moral courage rather than unthinking obedience. Others emphasize the role of education and historical memory. Societies must confront their histories honestly, without comforting myths that absolve perpetrators of responsibility. The decades Germany spent avoiding confrontation with Wehrmacht crimes allowed the clean Wehrmacht myth to flourish, giving former soldiers and officers the psychological space to portray themselves as victims rather than perpetrators. Only when German society forced itself to examine the archival evidence could genuine reckoning begin. The comparison with other military forces proved instructive. The United States military executed only one soldier for desertion during World War II, Private Eddie Slovic, shot by firing squad in France in January 1945. Yet American forces fought with comparable determination to the Wehrmacht. This suggested that draconian punishment was not necessary for military effectiveness. The US military certainly had its own serious problems with war crimes, particularly in the Pacific Theater. But these crimes were not driven by a military justice system that executed tens of thousands of its own soldiers. The Wehrmacht's brutal disciplinary system and its simultaneous tolerance of war crimes against civilians revealed a hierarchy of values that prioritized obedience to authority and military cohesion above human life and moral law. Stealing from the military supply system was a more serious offense than murdering Jewish children. Going absent without leave warranted execution. Participating in mass murder warranted promotion. This twisted moral framework, documented exhaustively in the archives, showed how profoundly the Nazi regime had corrupted traditional military values. Historians also grappled with individual cases that complicated simple narratives. Ludwig Baumann, arrested in June 1942 for attempting to desert from occupied France, spent decades after the war fighting to clear his name. He represented thousands of soldiers who had been executed or imprisoned for refusing to serve a criminal regime. Their stories, long suppressed or ignored, gradually emerged from archives and survivors' testimonies. In 2009, Baumann finally received official rehabilitation when Germany overturned Nazi-era military court verdicts. But what about cases like that of Seaman Bruno Dorfer and Rainer Beck, executed by firing squad on May 13, 1945, 5 days after Germany's surrender? They had deserted from the Kriegsmarine, and Beck was half Jewish, almost certainly attempting to escape murder. An illegal court-martial, composed of captured and disarmed German officers held under Allied guard in Amsterdam, sentenced them to death. Astoundingly, Canadian military authorities allowed the execution to proceed, even providing German rifles and a truck for transport. The incident demonstrated how deeply ingrained military loyalty and discipline could override basic justice and humanity, even among the captors. The case raised disturbing questions about Allied complicity in Nazi military justice. Canadian authorities apparently felt obliged to work with their German counterparts to maintain order among the massive surrendered German forces in the Netherlands. They permitted the German command hierarchy to continue functioning, including its brutal military justice system, as a matter of convenience. The executions were carried out by a German firing squad under Canadian escort. No one questioned the proceedings at the time. Only decades later did historians recognize the execution as fundamentally illegitimate and tragic. These cases illustrated the corrupting nature of military systems that prioritize discipline and order above justice and human rights. Once such systems are established and normalized, they acquire momentum that transcends individual actors. Canadian soldiers who escorted the firing squad were not Nazis, but they participated in Nazi military justice nonetheless, because institutional structures and assumptions about military authority overrode moral considerations. The historians who first uncovered the true scope of Wehrmacht military justice and the reality of what happened to soldiers who refused to participate in war crimes experienced something akin to intellectual vertigo. The comfortable assumptions that had structured understanding of the Nazi period for decades suddenly collapsed. The myth of soldiers with no choice, the idea that Wehrmacht personnel were simply following orders under threat of execution, dissolved when confronted with the actual documentary evidence. What emerged from the archives was more disturbing than the myth it replaced. The truth was that most German soldiers who participated in the Holocaust and other war crimes did so not because they feared execution, but because of some combination of ideological conviction, careerism, social pressure, psychological mechanisms of self-justification, and the corrupting influence of systems that normalized atrocity. They had choices, and they made them, and those choices resulted in the deaths of millions of innocent people. The final insight that shook historians was the realization of how effective the post-war cover-up had been. Wehrmacht officers and veterans, aided by sympathetic historians and public figures in the West, had successfully promulgated the clean Wehrmacht myth for decades. They portrayed the German military as professional, honorable, and distinct from the SS and Nazi party organizations that committed atrocities. They claimed that soldiers had no choice but to follow orders, that refusing meant certain death. This myth served multiple purposes. It allowed former soldiers to live with themselves. It facilitated West Germany's rearmament and integration into NATO during the Cold War, and it provided psychological comfort to German society, trying to move beyond the shame of the Nazi era. The 1995 Wehrmacht exhibition, organized by the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, marked a turning point. The exhibition displayed graphic photographs of ordinary Wehrmacht troops participating in war crimes, documenting military involvement in mass executions, reprisal killings, starvation of prisoners, and support for Holocaust operations. The exhibition sparked massive controversy and soul-searching in Germany. Some veterans protested vehemently, insisting the photographs misrepresented the military's conduct, but the archival evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Historian Hannes Heer, who helped organize the exhibition, argued that war crimes had been systematically covered up by scholars and former soldiers. Historian Wolfram Wetter called the Clean Wehrmacht thesis a collective perjury. The exhibition forced German society to confront what the military had actually done during the war and to abandon comfortable myths about honor and duty that had obscured the reality of mass criminality. The transformation of German military culture that followed these revelations represents one of the most profound institutional changes in modern history. The Bundeswehr became perhaps the only military force in the world explicitly structured around the principle that soldiers must refuse illegal orders. German military law today makes clear that unconditional authority and loyalty to superiors cannot exist. This is not merely theoretical. German courts have repeatedly upheld the rights of soldiers to refuse orders they believe to be illegal, and the military has no separate court-martial system, ensuring that military justice remains subject to civilian legal oversight. The irony is almost overwhelming. The Wehrmacht, which executed more than 20,000 of its own soldiers to enforce brutal discipline and ideological conformity, created a military that could not tolerate moral dissent. Modern Germany, having confronted this history, created a military that demands moral dissent when confronted with illegal orders. The transformation reflects hard-won wisdom purchased at the cost of millions of lives and decades of national soul-searching. Yet the lessons extend far beyond Germany. Every military force faces the tension between discipline and independent moral judgment. Every society faces the question of how to prevent atrocities while maintaining effective defense forces. The Wehrmacht records provide a case study in how military organizations can become instruments of genocide when they prioritize obedience over ethics, when they create cultures that reward participation in crimes and punish moral resistance. The archives also reveal the limitations of legal and institutional solutions. German military law during the Nazi period was not, on its face, dramatically different from military law in other nations. What made it uniquely deadly was the ideology that infused its application and the criminal purposes to which military force was directed. Changing laws and institutions is necessary but insufficient. Preventing future atrocities requires changing military culture, educating soldiers about their moral responsibilities, and creating societal consensus that some orders must never be followed regardless of consequences. The individual stories hidden in the court-martial records haunt these broader lessons. Each execution record represents a person, often very young, who faced an impossible choice between military duty as defined by a criminal regime and moral obligation to refuse participation in evil. Some chose resistance and paid with their lives. Others complied and carried the weight of participation in mass murder. Still others tried to find middle ground, to survive without actively participating in the worst crimes, with varying degrees of success. What happened to soldiers who said no? The answer, historians discovered, depended entirely on what they were saying no to. Soldiers who said no to desertion laws, who tried to escape the war, who expressed defeatist thoughts, who engaged in minor insubordination, faced brutal punishment, including execution. Soldiers who said no to participating in mass murder of civilians generally faced transfer, social pressure, and career consequences, but not execution. The system revealed its true priorities through this distinction. It cared more about military discipline and obedience to authority than about preventing the greatest crimes imaginable. This is the revelation that shocked historians when they finally examined the Nazi military justice records in full. This is the uncomfortable truth that emerged from dusty archives and forced reconsideration of everything previously assumed about choice and responsibility during the Third Reich. The Wehrmacht did not execute soldiers for refusing to commit war crimes. It executed them for challenging military authority and attempting to escape participation in a criminal war. The implications of this distinction continue to reverberate through military ethics, international law, and historical understanding more than 80 years after the war's end. The final lesson is perhaps the most important and most difficult to accept. Evil on the scale of the Holocaust does not require a population of monsters. It requires ordinary people who make ordinary calculations about career advancement, social acceptance, and personal survival. It requires institutions that channel individual choices toward criminal ends. It requires ideologies that provide justification for the unjustifiable. And it requires silence from those who witness crimes but choose not to resist. The Wehrmacht military justice records demonstrate that resistance was possible, that saying no to atrocity did not inevitably mean execution, that individual soldiers had more agency than post-war myths acknowledged. But the records also show how rarely soldiers exercise that agency, how effective systems of social control can be even without threat of death, and how easily human beings can accommodate themselves to participating in evil when surrounded by others doing the same. This is what historians realized when they examined the Nazi records. The Holocaust happened not because soldiers had no choice, but because so many made the choice to participate or to remain silent. Understanding this truth is painful but necessary. Only by confronting how ordinary people became perpetrators of extraordinary crimes can societies hope to prevent future atrocities. Only by acknowledging that saying no was possible, even if difficult and dangerous, can we hold perpetrators accountable and honor those who did resist. The archives speak across the decades with clarity that cannot be ignored. They tell us that evil prevails not primarily through direct coercion, but through the corruption of institutions, the manipulation of ideologies, the exploitation of careerism and conformity, and the silence of witnesses. They tell us that the greatest bulwark against future atrocities is not stronger discipline or harsher punishment, but fostering cultures, military and civilian, that reward moral courage and independent ethical judgment. The moment historians realized what actually happened to soldiers who said no transformed understanding of the Nazi period and continues to inform how military ethics are understood and taught worldwide. It was not the discovery anyone expected or wanted, but it was the truth that the records revealed. And that truth, uncomfortable and devastating as it may be, is what history demands we confront and remember.